Janelle Matthews was born on February 9, 1972 to 13-year-old Terry Vieira at Cottage Hospital in Santa Barbara, California. The circumstances of her birth were obviously challenging as her biological mother was just a child herself. 6 weeks after her birth, Janelle was adopted by James, who is often referred to as Jim, and Gloria Matthews, who provided her with a loving home and family. She joined an older sister, Jennifer, at the family home, and several years later, the family relocated from California to Greeley, Colorado. Later on, Jim would become the principal of Platte Valley Elementary School in Kersey, Colorado. The Matthews family was deeply religious and actively involved in their local church, the Sunnyview Church of the Nazarene. They were described as a close-knit family who lived a very full life centered around their faith, community involvement, and children's activities. Janelle was described by her family as an athletic and talented child with a passion for singing and performing. Her love for music led her to join the Franklin Middle School Honor Choir, where she would regularly perform at school concerts and community events. This involvement in the choir would tragically place her at the Christmas concert on the night of her disappearance. On the evening of December 20th, 1984, just 5 days before Christmas, Janelle attended a Christmas concert at the Intra-West Bank of Denver as part of her middle school choir. The concert was a special holiday performance where she sang Jingle Bells with her fellow members. Jim was attending his older daughter Jennifer's basketball game, while Gloria was out of state caring for an ill family member. This left Janelle alone at home, a situation that would normally not have been considered dangerous in the safe community of Greeley. After the concert concluded, Janelle received a ride home from her friend Deanna Ross and Deanna's father, Russell Ross. They arrived at the Matthews residence at approximately 8:15 p.m. Russell waited until he saw Janelle turn on the lights inside the house before driving away, ensuring she had safely entered her home. At approximately 8:30 p.m., Janelle answered a phone call and took a message for her father. This phone call was the last confirmed contact anyone had with Janelle. The message she took showed no indication of distress or danger. When Jim returned home from the basketball game at 9:30 p.m., he found the garage door open but no sign of Janelle. Her shoes and shawl were found near a heater in the family room, a place where she often lounged around. The television was still on, and there were signs that she had been having a normal evening at home. Jennifer arrived home at 10 p.m., but she had not seen Janelle and had no knowledge of her whereabouts. Initially, Jim thought his daughter might be at a friend's house, but after calling around and waiting for about an hour, he became increasingly concerned. The fact that her shoes were left behind was particularly troubling, as with snow on the ground, it was unlikely she would venture far without proper footwear. At approximately 10:15 p.m., Jim called the police. The Greeley Police Department responded quickly to the missing child report. Mayor John Gates, who was 27 years old at the time and serving as a police officer, was among those who responded to the scene. His assignment that night was to canvass the neighborhood, going door to door to ask residents if they had seen or heard anything suspicious. Unfortunately, no one in the neighborhood reported seeing or hearing anything unusual that evening. The only physical evidence discovered at the scene were footprints in the fresh snow outside the Matthews home. These footprints were found near the windows of the house, suggesting that someone had been looking inside. What made these footprints particularly significant was that someone had attempted to conceal them using a garden rake from the Matthews' own garage. There were no signs of forced entry or struggle inside the home. The house showed no evidence of violence or disturbance, which led investigators to believe that Janelle may have been lured outside or convinced to leave voluntarily. As is typical in missing child cases, law enforcement initially focused their investigation on family members. Jim himself became a suspect and was subjected to multiple polygraph tests. He underwent examination by what he described as the #1 interrogator west of the Mississippi, an FBI agent who told him he had failed the polygraph. Despite this setback, Jim continued to cooperate fully with the investigation, understanding that it was necessary to clear family members before expanding the search. A second polygraph test was administered by local police, and Jim eventually grew frustrated with the continued suspicion. He told investigators, "I have been very honest, I've been accessible to you anytime you wanted, but I'm getting sick of this because I am innocent." He was eventually cleared as a suspect, leaving investigators with no viable leads. With no physical evidence beyond the footprints and no viable suspects, the case quickly went cold. The investigation continued sporadically over the years with periodic reviews and re-examinations of evidence, but no significant breakthroughs emerged. Janelle became one of the first missing children to be featured on milk cartons across America. The Missing Children Milk Carton program had just begun in late 1984, with the National Child Safety Council launching a nationwide coordinated effort in December 1984. The case garnered such national attention that President Ronald Reagan mentioned Janelle Matthews in a speech to the National Newspaper Association on March 7, 1985. In his remarks, Reagan said, "I learned about Janelle Matthews of Greeley, Colorado, who would have celebrated a happy 13th birthday with her family just last month. But 5 days before Christmas, Janelle disappeared from her home." In 1994, 10 years after the disappearance, the family made the difficult decision to hold a memorial service and have Janelle declared legally dead. The trauma of Janelle's disappearance eventually led the Matthews family to leave Greeley. About 2 years after the disappearance, they made the painful decision to pack up and move away from the community where they had built their lives. Jim explained the decision by saying, "You have to go on with life. You can't let this consume you." Despite the case going cold, law enforcement never completely abandoned the investigation. The Greeley Police Department periodically reviewed the case, and in 2015, they began a renewed inquiry into Janelle's disappearance. This renewed effort involved recontacting witnesses and applying the latest forensic advances to the investigation. Fast forward to July 23, 2019, a breakthrough occurred. Construction workers installing a pipeline in a remote area of Weld County, Colorado, discovered human remains. The workers were excavating at an intersection approximately 15 miles southeast of the Matthews family's former home. The remains were discovered at 4:50 p.m., leading to an immediate investigation. The Weld County Coroner's Office used DNA evidence to positively identify the remains as those of Janelle Matthews. The forensic report revealed that Janelle's cause of death was a gunshot wound to the head, confirming that she had been murdered. Janelle was reportedly still wearing the same outfit she had worn on the night she disappeared, suggesting she had been killed shortly after her abduction. As you'd expect, the discovery of the remains was devastating for the family. Jennifer, Janelle's sister, said the family experienced some closure when they learned definitively that her sister was murdered. However, she also noted that discovering the remains brought a new type of grief as it confirmed their worst fears about what had happened. Now that Janelle was confirmed to have been murdered, the new question was who killed her. There were a handful of names that interested investigators, but the man we're going to discuss was named Stephen Dana Panky. Stephen was born and raised in the Midwest before moving to Colorado in the 1970s. In 1984, at the time of the disappearance, he was a 38-year-old man living in Greeley with his wife Angela Hicks and their young son. The family resided approximately 2 miles from the Matthews home. Stephen worked various jobs over the years, including as a security guard and used car salesman. He had a history of run-ins with law enforcement, mostly involving minor and non-violent allegations such as creating a nuisance and harassment. Notably, on December 19th, 1984, just 1 day before Janelle's disappearance, Stephen was arrested at a bank for harassment and criminal trespass. This arrest occurred after he argued with a bank teller and police were called to the scene. Both the Matthews family and the Panky family attended the same church. However, their connections to the church were different. While the Matthews family were active, well-regarded members of the community, Stephen had a more troubled history with the church. He had worked as a youth pastor and janitor at the church until being excommunicated in 1977 following an altercation with another congregant. The circumstances of his departure from the church were very significant, as they involved allegations of assault by a woman he had been dating. While the charges were eventually dismissed after the woman asked for the case to be dropped, the incident led to his removal from the church. Jim, who joined the church after Stephen's departure, corrected some of the claims Stephen made about his role there. While Stephen claimed to have been a youth pastor, Jim clarified that he was not a youth worker at our church, he was the janitor. This discrepancy highlighted Stephen's tendency to embellish his role and importance in various situations. From the very beginning, Stephen's behavior following Janelle's disappearance was unusual and suspicious. According to his ex-wife Angela, on December 21st, 1984, just one day after the girl disappeared, Stephen announced that the family would be taking a sudden trip to California to visit his parents for Christmas. This announcement was particularly strange because Stephen had previously decided not to make the trip. Angela testified that Stephen told her to, quote, "Get us ready to go. We're leaving before daylight tomorrow morning to go to Big Bear for Christmas." The sudden nature of this trip, combined with its timing immediately after the disappearance, raised significant suspicions among investigators. During their trip to California, Stephen's behavior became even more concerning. Angela testified that her husband, who had previously forbidden radio and television use in their home, suddenly insisted that she turn on the radio during their drive back to Colorado. She said he was specifically searching for news about Janelle's disappearance, having her flip through stations for several hours looking for updates. Once they returned to Greeley, Stephen drove directly to a grocery store where he made Angela buy local newspapers. He then insisted that she read all the articles about Janelle's disappearance aloud to him, with Angela testifying that, quote, "He wanted me to read each article out loud to him, and I recall him having me read each one at least 3 times. One of the most damaging aspects of his behavior was his repeated attempts to insert himself into the investigation. About a month after the disappearance, Stephen contacted the Fort Collins FBI office claiming to have information about the case. He told agents, "I want to talk to you. It may or may not have something to do with the Janelle Matthews case." His story to the FBI involved a bizarre claim about his father-in-law who worked as a groundskeeper at a Greeley cemetery. Stephen alleged that 7 days after Janelle disappeared, his father-in-law told him that, quote, "A cop had contacted him and said that he had a body he wanted to be buried." This story was later revealed to be one of many lies Stephen told over the years. Throughout the decades that followed, Stephen continued to involve himself in the investigation. He repeatedly claimed to have additional knowledge of the crime and asked for immunity in exchange for information. The criminal indictment noted that he intentionally inserted himself in the investigation many times over the years, claiming to have knowledge of the crime which grew inconsistent and incriminating over time. His claims included specific details about the crime scene that had not been released to the public. Most significantly, he claimed that on the evening of the abduction, a rake was used to cover up tracks left in the snow. This detail was particularly incriminating because only the Matthews family, investigators, and presumably the killer knew about the raked footprints. This obsession with the case extended to his legal troubles and court appearances. In 1999, he told the Idaho Supreme Court, after a conviction for causing a scene in a bank, that the conviction was in part an attempt to force him to become an informant in Janelle's disappearance. He also wrote that he feared he might get the death penalty for revealing the location of her body. After the trip, Angela stated that her husband continued his strange behavior. He spent hours digging holes in their yard, and during a church service where the pastor said he had heard a message from God that Janelle would be found alive, Stephen yelled, "False prophet," and had to be removed from the church. Additionally, Angela said that at their son's funeral in 2008, Stephen became extremely emotional and said, "I hope God didn't allow this to happen because of Janelle Matthews." Around 1986, approximately 2 years after Janelle's disappearance, Stephen and his family left Greeley and moved from state to state before eventually settling in Idaho in 1989. This move came at a time when the investigation into the case was still active, though it had begun to lose momentum. On September 4th, 2019, just weeks after the remains were discovered, police in Twin Falls, Idaho, executed a search warrant at Stephen's condo. The warrant stated that investigators had probable cause to believe that he abducted and murdered Janelle. Rather than remaining silent or cooperating quietly, Stephen immediately began giving interviews to media outlets. He spoke to CBS affiliate KMVT and other news organizations, proclaiming his innocence while simultaneously inserting himself further into the case. In one interview, he said, "I've never met Janelle Matthews. I've never met anybody in her family." He also claimed that he voluntarily gave DNA and offered to take a polygraph. However, when investigators actually tried to interview him in August prior to the raid, he immediately asked for a lawyer and refused to answer questions. On October 13, 2020, a grand jury indicted Stephen Panky on charges of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and false reporting in connection with Janelle Matthews' death. Stephen was 69 years old at the time of his indictment and was held without bail at the Ada County Jail in Boise until he was extradited to Colorado. Stephen's first trial began on October 14, 2021 in Weld County, Colorado. The prosecution argued that Stephen's behavior and statements over the years incriminated him in the murder. The defense argued that his obsessive interest in the case could be attributed to Asperger's syndrome and that he was simply a true crime junkie who liked attention. The trial lasted several weeks and featured testimony from numerous witnesses, including Angela Hicks, law enforcement officers, and members of the Greeley community. The prosecution's case relied heavily on circumstantial evidence as there was no physical evidence linking Stephen to the crime. This first trial ended in a mistrial in November of the same year. The second trial occurred in October of 2022, and Stephen was found guilty of first-degree felony murder, second-degree kidnapping, and false reporting. He was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 20 years. At the time of his sentencing, Stephen was 71 years old. On a warm summer morning in 1974, 12-year-old Leslie Metcalf was walking with her family through the Race Point Dunes of Provincetown when she made a horrific discovery. Initially mistaking the remains for a dead deer, the girl had found the naked body of a woman lying face down on a beach blanket in the dunes about 1 mile east of the Race Point Ranger Station inside the Cape Cod National Seashore. The crime scene was described as brutal. The victim had suffered devastating injuries. Her skull was crushed from blunt force trauma to the head. Her head was nearly severed from her body, and both hands had been completely removed. The deliberate removal of the hands was clearly intended to prevent identification through fingerprints, while several teeth had also been removed or knocked out. The body showed signs of assault that appeared to have occurred after death, and there was evidence that the killer had been lying next to the victim. The victim was estimated to have been dead for several weeks before discovery, with insect activity confirming this timeline. She had brownish-colored hair tied in a ponytail and pink-painted toenails. Investigators couldn't come to a precise age for the victim and instead placed her between 25 and 45 years old. Locals would go on to refer to the woman as the Lady of the Dunes. The case became particularly personal for Police Chief James Meads, who took charge of the investigation and became obsessed with solving it. Meads was known to carry the victim's skull in a duffel bag as he traveled, seeking identification and pursuing leads across the country. The investigation employed every available technique of its time and evolved with advancing technology. Initial efforts included neighborhood canvasses throughout the Cape Cod area and beyond, reviews of thousands of missing person cases from across the United States, clay model facial reconstructions created by forensic artists, age regression drawings showing what the victim might have looked like at different ages, and dental record comparisons with missing persons databases. Multiple exhumations were conducted in 1980, 2000, and 2013, each time hoping that advancing forensic techniques might yield new clues. Over the decades, numerous theories popped up about both the victim's identity and her killer. One of the most persistent early leads involved Rory Jean Kessinger, a 24-year-old alleged gun runner and substance smuggler who had escaped from Plymouth County Jail on May 27, 1974, just 2 months before the body's discovery. However, DNA comparison during the 2000 exhumation definitively ruled out Kessinger as being the victim. The case also generated speculation about connections to organized crime, particularly due to the professional nature of the hand removal, which led some to suspect a connection to Boston gangster James Whitey Bulger. Another theory that gained significant attention was proposed by horror writer Joe Hill, son of Stephen King, who suggested in 2018 that the victim might have been an extra in the 1975 film Jaws, which was being filmed in the area around the time of the murder. This theory was never substantiated, but added to the public fascination with the case. The case remained cold until 2022 when the FBI partnered with Othram Labs, a Texas-based forensic genealogy company specializing in extracting DNA from degraded samples. Ultimately, they were able to generate a DNA profile despite the extensive damage and contamination of the samples. On October 31st, 2022, the FBI announced the identification of the Lady of the Dunes as Ruth Marie Terry, a 37-year-old woman from Tennessee. Ruth was born on September 8, 1936 in Whitwell, Tennessee, to Johnny and Eva Terry. Her early life was said to be difficult, including the death of her mother at age 23. In 1957, following a brief marriage, Ruth left Tennessee to work at the Fisher Body Automotive plant in Livonia, Michigan. In 1958, she gave birth to a son named Richard, but financial difficulties prevented her from caring for him. She made the difficult decision to allow the superintendent of her workplace, Richard Hanchett Sr., to adopt her son in exchange for paying off her expenses. After the adoption was finalized, Ruth moved to California. She maintained some contact with her family over the years and in 1972 reached out to her son Richard, though he wasn't ready to meet her at the time due to personal struggles. The investigation revealed that Ruth had ties to California, Massachusetts, and Michigan. On February 16, 1974, just 4 months before her death, she married an antiques dealer named Guy Rockwell Moldavin in Reno, Nevada. The couple visited Ruth's family in Tennessee in the spring of 1974, which would be the last time her relatives saw her alive. During this visit, her family noticed concerning changes in her behavior. Her grandniece Brittany Novogloski later recalled that Ruth wasn't herself whenever she was with Guy, who exhibited possessive behavior. The couple told Ruth's family they were planning to travel across the United States looking for antiques, and they specifically mentioned visiting Massachusetts as they were leaving. Following the identification, investigators quickly focused on her husband, Guy, as the prime suspect. On August 28, 2023, Cape and Islands District Attorney Robert J. Galliboy officially announced that Guy was responsible for Ruth's death. The evidence linking him to the murder was compelling. Guy was the last person to see Ruth alive during their summer 1974 honeymoon trip. When he returned from the trip, he was driving what was believed to be Ruth's car. He told witnesses that Ruth had passed away and later claimed they had fought during their honeymoon and he hadn't heard from her again. Investigation into Guy's background revealed a disturbing pattern of violence against women. Born in Santa Fe, New Mexico in 1923, he was described as a charming rascal with the gift of gab, who had been married at least 5 times. 14 years before marrying Ruth, Guy was the prime suspect in the disappearance and presumed murder of his second wife, Manzanita Aileen Ryan, aged 40, and her 18-year-old daughter, Dolores Ann Mearns. The pair disappeared on April 1st, 1960, and were reported missing when they failed to make their regular monthly trip to Vancouver to visit Manzanita's ex-husband. In July 1960, Guy divorced Manzanita for desertion and immediately married his third wife, Evelyn Emerson. 5 days after this marriage, Emerson's stepmother gave Guy a cashier's check for $10,000 to buy antiques for resale in Canada. Both Guy and the money subsequently vanished. When police investigated the Seattle home where Guy had lived with Manzanita and Dolores, they made a dark discovery. In August 1960, authorities found bits of human tissue and pieces of human body in a newly sealed septic tank. Additional evidence was found in the attic, including teeth, human blood, and other signs of violent crime. Some limbs were also found floating in the Columbia River. Guy was eventually arrested in New York City's Greenwich Village after a nationwide manhunt. Despite being questioned for 2 weeks about the disappearances, he never confessed, and apparently lacking sufficient evidence, prosecutors were unable to charge him with murder. He was convicted only of grand larceny for stealing money from his third wife's family and served time in prison before being released in 1962. Media reports described Guy as a sometimes actor and DJ in California, an antiques dealer in Seattle, and a bunco artist and great lover everywhere he went. The New York Daily News reported that by 1960, he had 3 wives and many sweethearts, and was known around Greenwich Village for his nightly soirees with beatniks, art lovers, celebrities, and celebrity hunters, all bound by Guy's magnetism and offbeat philosophy. After Ruth's death, he wrote a cookbook titled Cooking with Rump Oil that appeared to contain subtle references to his crimes. One recipe, called Cape Cod Shid, featured a strange drawing of a creature with long, wavy hair, similar to Ruth's hairstyle. The accompanying text read, "Out of the water and into the pan. The sweet turpentine taste will turn to that of a burnt glove, and the tender look will become one of despair." Despite being a suspect in multiple murders, Guy continued to evade justice and build relationships on the West Coast. He married his fifth wife, Phyllis Smurl, who was listed as his widow in his 2002 obituary. He spent his final years working as a radio talk show host and died in 2002 at age 78 after a lengthy illness, 20 years before Ruth's identification. The official closure of the Lady of the Dunes case in August 2023 provided long-awaited answers to a mystery that had stood for nearly 50 years. However, the resolution came with significant limitations. Guy's death in 2002 meant that he would never face trial for his crimes, robbing Ruth's family of the opportunity to see justice served in court. "I wish he was still alive so he could face what he did," said Ruth's son, Richard Hanchett. Richard expressed both relief at finally knowing what had happened to his mother and frustration that her killer had escaped justice.